Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of In the Kitchen with Baker Girl. Thank you, Jesus. It is another beautiful day to be in the kitchen. Now, today I thought I'd share with you this recipe for these delicious, buttery, soft yeast rolls. Now, if you know anything about Southern baking, you know and down in the South, we love a good yeast roll. And I mean, you can serve it with anything, whether it's barbecue chicken, fried chicken, pot roast, fried fish, whatever. If it's a good Southern family sit down meals, there has to be yeast rolls on the table. Like, that's not even an option. Yes, there is cornbread, but there's got to be some good yeast rolls too. And for good yeast rolls, you need a good recipe. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and follow along and hit the notification bell so you won't miss out anytime I upload a new recipe. Now, I will be using a stand mixer to make these yeast rolls, but you can by all means do them by hand. That's perfectly fine. You just need a large bowl, either a Danish dough whisk or a wooden spoon, and a surface to knead your dough on, and you're good to go. You don't have to use a stand mixer, but I will be using these, making these using a stand mixer today. Now, to start off, I want to start by adding my liquid ingredients to my mixing bowl. So I have here some whole milk, and I'm going to add that right into my mixer bowl. And then I'm going to add in some instant yeast. Now, I prefer to use instant yeast than active dry yeast. There is a difference between the two. Instant yeast is just what it sounds like. It's faster. Active dry yeast is a little bit slower. If you are going to be doing these, say, an overnight rise with these, say you mix them, you mix the dough, you put the dough in the refrigerator, you let it rise overnight in the refrigerator, I would use active dry yeast. If you're going to be doing a one-day bake, meaning you mix it, you let it rise, you shape your rolls, you let them rise, they hit straight into the oven, then I would use instant yeast. So just sprinkle the yeast right on top of the milk. Now, instant yeast does not have to be activated in liquid as active dry yeast does. But I have learned over the years that if you add any kind of yeast, if it's a dry yeast or a fresh yeast, any kind of yeast does better when it has a little bit of time to rehydrate in liquid. So even if you buy the little packets of yeast and they say you can just mix it right in with the dry ingredients, which you cannot do with active dry yeast, by the way. You do need to hydrate active dry yeast. Instant yeast, they tell you can just sprinkle it right in with the dry ingredients and it's good to go. But as I say, I don't like to do that. I like to sprinkle it over my liquid and let it activate and rehydrate that way. Now, it's a good idea if you let this sit for a few minutes and you'll see little bubbles start to form up and you know your yeast is active before you move on into a recipe. You know your yeast is active by just letting this rest for a few minutes. It'll turn a little bubbly. But before I do that, I'm going to add in a little pinch of my sugar. Yeast loves sugar. I mean, yeast is like me. It loves carbs. So I'm just going to add a little pinch of the sugar in and let this sit for just a few minutes until it starts to bubble. And then when it starts to bubble, I know my yeast is fresh and I'm good to proceed with my recipe. This is something that you do to make sure you don't ruin an entire batch of dough, because the only way, if you don't do this step and say your yeast is not fresh, the only way you would know is when your bread just does not rise. So to save yourself that grief, just let it hang out for a few minutes. And I can already see my yeast is starting to froth a little bit. Okay, so my yeast has got nice and foamy and it's all good and bubbly. I can go ahead and add in the remainder of the sugar. You don't have to use, I use 2 tablespoons of sugar. You don't have to use that much sugar. You can skip the sugar. The sugar helps the rolls to get nice and brown though. It won't make them sweet. Not that amount of sugar won't make them sweet. You can make them a little sweeter. So I'm going to go ahead and just mix in the sugar. And then I'm going to add in 1 egg. So just cracking one egg. And there we are. That's a room temperature egg, by the way. You kind of want to avoid using very cold things, such as the milk is room temperature. The egg is room temperature, so forth. You want to avoid using very cold things. Just go ahead and mix that in. And then I'm going to add in I have here 1 baked potato, and this is a Yukon Gold potato, and I've removed the skin. Now, you're gonna say, whoa, I thought we were making yeast rolls. We are making yeast rolls. The potato helps to give you a softer yeast rolls. Now, there are various ways you can add into things to make your yeast rolls very soft, but a potato is really an old-fashioned way of doing them. If you don't have a potato, if you don't want to add actual potato, you can use some potato water instead of the milk. Now, that's another old-fashioned tip. Our grandmothers did this. They would save water from boiling potatoes, and then they would use that. The idea is yeast, as I said earlier, yeast loves starch and carbs, and a potato is a lot of starch and a lot of carbs, and the very thing that yeast loves. So not only is it going to give you a very nice soft roll, it's also going to help the yeast to be more active. So you can mash the potato, by the way, but I have here a ricer, and this is I'm just going to add the potato to it, drop it in, and I'm going to rice the potato right into the bowl. So just give it a, and in goes the potato. As I say, you can mash the potato, but I have a ricer, and this is kind of like a one and done thing. And you're always left with a little bit of potato left on the end of the ricer. I'm just going to take my spatula and scrape that off and scoop it right in. There we are. Potato ricers are fun because you get a super, super smooth consistency. Okay, and there's always a little bit left, but it's all smushed up anyway, so I'm just going to tip that right on in. Set that aside. Now I want to go ahead and I'm just going to give this just a tiny mix to mix it in, just like that. Now I'm going to add in my flour, and I will be weighing my flour, so I'm just going to set my scale on. And of course, since we are making rolls, I am using bread flour. You can use all-purpose flour, but all-purpose flour, along with the potato, along with the milk, along with the butter, it can give you a roll that's a little too soft and it won't hold its shape. It won't have enough strength. So, and potatoes don't have any protein in them like that. So you want to use a good bread flour for this recipe. So I'm just going to weigh my flour. Always weighing. That way you don't have to worry about, cups and spoons and all those things. So sprinkle that in. Now we want to add some salt, because I didn't add the salt at this point because you don't really want salt and yeast to come in too close direct contact. They're going to come in contact with one another anyway, but you don't want them to come into too direct contact. Not at this point. So I'm just going to sprinkle my salt right on top of the yeast. I'm using pink Himalayan salt. And the reason why I'm using pink Himalayan salt is because these are one-day rolls. If I was doing an overnight proof, I would use regular all-purpose white table salt because pink Himalayan salt causes your yeast to react a little faster. I talked about that in my salt episode, by the way, and I'll leave a link to that in the iCards where I go over how salt works and the different ways that salt reacts with yeast and how different salts react with yeast. So if you're interested, check that video out. Now I'm going to just give this just a little mix to mix the salt in, and I can remove my scale because everything else was weighed except for the flour. Now I'm going to put this on my stand mixer and go ahead and start mixing the dough. Now here I've got some butter, but I'm not going to add my butter in just yet, and I will explain while I combine the dough. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get my bowl set on my mixer, and I'm using my dough attachment, but you can use the paddle attachment, but you would need to switch to a dough attachment anyway. So I'm just going to go ahead and use it. And I'm just going to start mixing on a medium speed at this point. What you want to do is just kind of start forming an actual dough mass. You don't have to go crazy with a lot of kneading at this point. You just want to form an actual dough mass. And I like my red mixer because it's quiet. I think I've said this in another video. My purple mixer is more powerful. It has way more power than my red mixer. But my red mixer is a professional grade mixer. It is designed to be quiet. So if I was using my purple mixer, you couldn't hear me talk. I'm gonna add my dough shield on. This flour is kind of going all over the kitchen. This thing is a dream. It kind of helps to keep flour from flying all over the place. Okay, I'm gonna stop here, and that's only about maybe a couple of seconds of mixing. I'm gonna stop, and you don't need to just keep mixing at this point because we're going to incorporate our butter in. So I'll just show you what that looks like at this point. You see how we just have a nice massive dough. There's still some flour hanging out in the bottom of the bowl, and that's okay because we're going to incorporate our butter in now. Put this back on. There we are. Click it in place. Now we're ready to incorporate the butter. Now here I have 1 stick of butter that I melted and then I let it cool. Now you can use a stick of softened butter, and that is what I was aiming for, something similar to a stick of softened butter, but I didn't take the butter out before I started, so therefore I had to do a speedy method, which is just melting the butter and then letting it cool quickly in the refrigerator and then let it solidify a little bit. You don't want it to go back to firm butter, but you want it to be a little more solid than a stick of melted butter. Now, I'll explain my reason for doing it like that really quickly. If you add melted butter to a dough recipe, you must then count that melted butter in as a liquid and not a solid, because of course it is a liquid. And when you add melted butter into a dough recipe, because it's treated as a liquid, you'll need to add more flour or reduce one of your other liquids somewhere, whether it's the milk or the water or, you know, the egg, whatever. You'll need to reduce. You can't have the same amount of milk and then use melted butter. You'll need more flour. So in order to not have to decrease the milk, because I do want these to have a nice soft texture, that the milk does help with that, but I don't want my butter to act as a liquid. So I'm using softened butter, and softened butter changes the game, so to speak. It's now included into the dough as a solid and not a liquid. So just to tell you that real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my speed on to a medium low, which for a KitchenAid that would be speed 2. And I'm just going to add in my butter. So you can see how the butter is it's softer than softened butter, but it's not like a liquidy butter. And now I'm going to move on to a medium-high speed. You want to add it in a little bit at a time. Take your time and do this. Otherwise, if you add it in too fast, your dough kind of will collapse and it'll get a little greasy like. Just take your time. There's a little bit of milk solids to come out. I'm just going to not add that. Now I'm just going to scrape down the sides of the bowl because I can see some of the butter kind of went wee on the edges, which that happens. It happens even more so if you are using softened butter. You see your mixer would kind of fling butter around the surface. Now, one thing I am going to do before I proceed with mixing, I am going to take my bench knife and I'm just gonna scrape down the sides of the bowl. Just scrape it down. While you do this, it helps the dough, when it kicks off again in kneading, it just helps it to kind of kick off a little easier. It's no longer stuck. You've literally loosened the dough from the machine. Now, before I proceed with mixing, I'm going to take 1 tablespoon of flour, just a tablespoon. I might not even need a tablespoon. And I'm going to sprinkle it right around the bowl. Yeah, I didn't use a whole tablespoon. And what that does is that gives your dough the chance to kind of start to knead before it starts to collapse again. And I'll show you what that looks like. So just go ahead and kick off. And then start off at a rather high speed at this point. There we are, and my dough is not sticking to my bowl. If I had done that before and did not add that flour to it and then start off at a high speed, my dough would have automatically stuck to the sides of the bowl and it would just turn into a soupy mess. So now at this point, you want to let your dough knead. And that can take anywhere from 5 minutes to 8 minutes. Don't skimp on the kneading time. As a matter of fact, set a timer. Don't skimp on the kneading time. If you under-knead your rolls, they won't have a good texture. You're building gluten, because this is bread and we want gluten. You're building gluten. So the only way you're going to do that is you got to knead it. So just set your timer and let it mix away to knead your dough. So I want to show you, if you can hear me, if you notice, the dough is starting to pull away from the sides of the mixing bowl. Little bit by little bit, it's gradually cleaning itself off the sides of the bowl. And that will only happen if you just let the dough knead the appropriate amount of time. As it continues to knead, it will eventually clear the sides of the bowl entirely. And that is how you know your dough is finished kneading, and it's kneaded to an appropriate gluten structure. Okay. The dough has finished kneading and my timer is going off. So actually that took me a total of 10 minutes. And that was precisely 10 minutes because my timer was going off. So I want to show you what that looks like. And this is what the dough looks like now. So you can see how it's nice and smooth. It's not sticky to my fingers. I can actually touch it and there's no dough on my fingers. So my stand mixer has done its job. Good job, Rachel. Good job, old girl. And by the way, that mixer is it's still cool. That's the joys of having those big, those mixers. They don't get hot during long mix back. Now I'm just going to take my dough scraper and just scrape off my, my whisk attachment, my dough attachments. Okay, now there's a teeny little ring of dough right around there, so I'm just going to scrape that right on into that. But if you let it knead, it'll eventually pick that up, but that's not necessary. Now, while I'm on the topic of kneading, I do want to say there is a such thing as over kneading dough. And you don't want to do that. You want to avoid doing that at all costs. It's not necessary, and if you overdo it, it's just like overproving. If you overprove dough, the texture suffers. So there are some places that over knead dough because it rises faster, much faster, but the texture of the dough becomes dry and cottony like. So just avoid over kneading. As I say, you know your dough has kneaded to an appropriate gluten structure when it clears the sides of the bowl. And when you notice that it's starting to do that, and it's clearing the side of the bowl and the sides of your bowl are not all sticky, you're good to go. Stop it right there. Don't keep kneading because then you are now over kneading. You only need as much as the dough needs, if that makes sense. So I'm going to show you what is called a window pane test. And it's not necessary. You don't need to do this. But if you ever hear somebody refer to it, I'm just putting just a little bit of butter on my fingers, although the dough won't stick to your hand at this point. If you ever hear somebody talk about the window pane test, I'll show you what that is. So you take a little piece of dough and you begin to stretch it just like that. And if you can stretch it super thin like this, and it does not break, see, I can see the light through it, and it does not break, you've developed enough gluten. And this you can continue to stretch. Of course, if you just keep doing it, it will break. But this is thin enough that you see the light through, and that's good. So when you first start out, your dough would just break. It won't do anything. But as you keep kneading it like that, it will develop that. And that is all gluten. That is all down to the gluten. And the gluten, of course, is down to the protein in the flour. So because we're using bread flour, we have more protein, and therefore you get a much stronger gluten structure. So I'm just going to turn this over. There's no need to grease the bowl because we have plenty of butter in these roasts. No need to grease the bowl. So I'm just going to turn this over, and I'm going to cover it with a towel. I'm going to put it in a warm place, and I'm going to let it rise. And that can take anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, depending on how warm or cool your house is. But I'm just going to cover this and let it rise. And when the dough is risen, we'll come back and be ready to shape these yeast rolls. All right, the yeast rolls have risen. The dough has risen for the yeast rolls, and it has risen. It has more than doubled. Now, I did let it rise for about an hour and 45 minutes. I want to say about an hour and 45 minutes. And at 1 hour, I deflated the dough, and then I did just a simple little fold and then just covered it up and let it rise again. The idea behind that, the longer it takes for these kind of doughs to rise, the more flavor they have. Same thing with sourdough. If you let it take that time and let it rise, you get more flavor. A short proof just equals less flavor. A longer proof, a little more flavor. So that extra 45 minutes is better than just 1 hour if you can spare it. If you can't spare it, proceed with after 1 hour. All right, so I'm going to divide my dough into equal pieces. The best way to do that is to weigh it. I'm sorry. You can eyeball it, but I'm used to weighing portions of dough, so that's what I'm going to do. So, okay, so tip them back out. And now we can divide it. So if I wanted to do, say, a dozen rolls out of 1,152 grams, I just divide it by 12. And that would give me 96 grams per roll. So bring the scale back. And I'm just going to sprinkle a teeny little bit of flour. This dough is so nice, by the way. I don't need any extra flour. I don't need. But I'll just sprinkle a little bit on there anyway. So now I can start dividing this into portions. 96 grams each. That's 78 grams. And 90 grams. And 93, 94, 95, 96. And then just take it and shape it into just a rough little ball like that and set it aside. And you just keep doing that with all of your dough until you have 12 little balls of dough. Now I'm just going to start shaping these into little rounds. So you simply just take a piece of dough and fold going counterclockwise. just fold. And this finger folds and this finger tucks and helps to pinch that in. You can also put it on the countertop and do a little roll, cupping your fingers like that. That gives you a nice round. The idea is you're shaping the dough. You're not leaving it just little dough blobs. And really, really quickly, I want to say about measuring and weighing out things. Now, it may seem fussy to you to have to portion out dough by weight. You know, say for instance, bothering with the scale and all of that. But when you're baking professionally, you've got to have things accurate and everything needs to be the same. And so you can have, you know, like 4 big rolls and then 3 little rolls and then 4 medium rolls. All of your rolls need to be equal in size. So you get into a habit of weighing things when you bake professionally. It just makes more sense. And another thing I want to say that makes more sense is it's called scaling. In an industrial term, it's called scaling. If you can scale your recipes, that allows you to take one recipe and make 10 rolls, 50 rolls, 200 rolls, 300 rolls, 1,000 rolls, 2,000 rolls off of one recipe without you having to guess, how much do I need? How much? Everything can be pinpoint accurate down to the gram, and you can make 10 rolls or 10,000 rolls if you weigh your ingredients. So just keep shaping your rolls. So I have here a Pyrex baking dish that I'm going to bake my rolls in. Typically, I prefer to use stainless steel baking pans for my rolls. But I thought for a more traditional home-baked roll, I would use a glass dish. But by all means, you can use a sheet pan, a cookie sheet. You can use a cake pan, a round cake tin. You can also use a cast iron skillet. Either one would work very nicely. So I'm going to butter my pan. I just got a little bit of softened butter here. I'm going to butter my pan. And there's a couple of reasons why I'm being so generous with my butter. As the rolls bake, the butter will kind of get a little brown and toasty and help your rolls to brown a little better than if you just use regular baking spray. So just spread it around. You can use your fingers. Go a little faster if you use your fingers. But not as neat. So I'm just going to do it this way. And then I'm just going to place each one of my rolls in my baking tray, just like this. Very nice. It's been a while since I baked a small amount of yeast rolls. Normally I do large batches. Okay, so I am going to cover these with a little towel, and I might just spread just a tiny little bit of butter on them to keep them from drying out, because you don't want them to develop a skin. You can also, this is one area where I would suggest that you use plastic wrap. After you put a little butter on them, use some plastic wrap. You do not want them at this point to develop a skin. If they develop a skin, they won't rise good because the top of the crust of the dough has already gotten hard, and it won't expand like it would if it was nice and soft going into the oven. So cover these well with a piece of plastic wrap, set them aside and let them rise. And I'm going to take my remaining rolls and I'm just going to use these as hamburger buns. So you see, your recipe can do double duty. I'm going to set these aside and let them rise. Time to remove the plastic wrap, which you can reuse, by the way. You don't have to discard it. You can reuse it. Though you might want to be cautious because the rolls do have eggs in them, but that is totally reusable. So now it's time to egg wash the rolls. And you egg wash them because the egg wash just gives you beautiful golden brown. But if you don't want to use another egg, and by the way, I'm just using an egg white. I'm not using the yolk. If you don't want to use another egg, you can use some milk or some cream. You want to put something on them though. You don't want to put them in the oven with nothing. So just brush a little bit of the egg on them. Make sure you brush them on good. I remember years ago I was making yeast rolls for a wedding. This was a fairly large wedding too. Yeah, you know, it's a big wedding, a big guest list, and I was making all of these rolls for the rolls actually was not for the wedding itself. They were for the pre-wedding venue that the guests were having. I actually walked away from the rolls for just a little bit and they got too brown. They were really brown. And I was in a panic. I was in a total panic. And I'm like, what do I do? So I sent a picture of them to a friend of mine and I was like, I overbaked the rolls. And she was like, they look good to me. She said, Sarah, that's how I like my rolls. And I told her, I said, that is not going to work. It's not because the guest list was so upscale that I didn't want to present, you know, I'm particular about it doesn't matter who's eating my food. It doesn't matter where you come from or your financial status or whatever. If I'm presenting something to you or for you, I want it to be the absolute best that I possibly can. So, yeah, those rolls didn't make it. And I just went and made more rolls. It took a lot of time. But at least I felt confident in the rolls that I was presenting to my guests, to my customers. Now, as you can see, here are the rolls and then here are the hamburger buns. And that is, I just decided to make a couple of them into hamburger buns just to show you, you can take one roll and make both buns and rolls. You also can make hot dog buns out of this. It's just a different shape, but the same dough. And on the hamburger buns, I am going to sprinkle a few untoasted sesame seeds, just a few. This screams hamburger bun, so a few sesame seeds is always acceptable. You can use everything, bagel seasoning, or you can leave them plain. That's entirely up to you. So my oven is preheated to 365 degrees. That is without a fan. I'm not using the convection mode. Just regular 365 degrees, and I'm going to bake these until they are golden brown and well baked. And that could take probably right around 25 to 30 minutes, but keep your eye on them. Oh, wow, the rolls are out of the oven and the buns are too. Oh, those buns look good. Oh, wow, those look so good. And the yeast rolls. My, those look good. Wow. Thank you, Jesus. They look so good. Now, I'm going to brush these with just a little bit of butter. I'm just taking a regular brush and brushing them with a little bit of butter. You don't need to, they don't need it, but brushing them with butter helps to keep them nice and soft. It also makes them a little bit shiny. Okay. Nicely slathered with butter and ready to eat. I hope you guys have enjoyed this recipe on these super simple, soft yeast rolls. If you have, please give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned because the good Lord willing, I'll be back in the kitchen sharing another video with you guys. Take care, y'all. Bye.